Dying Earth is a setting for the Dungeon Crawl Classics tabletop RPG published in 2022 by Goodman Games after a successful Kickstarter. It's based on the weird fantasy novels and short stories by Jack Vance that were published between 1950 and 1984, and this DCC game setting is not to be confused with Pelgrane Press's The Dying Earth RPG, which was also based on Jack Vance's stories. I'm not going to be discussing or comparing the two Dying Earth games in this video. This one is just going to be focused on the Goodman Games DCC rendition. The setting is presented as 3 booklets in a box set. I first want to show you what they look like out of the box, then clear up exactly where the author's inspirations came from and how to get your hands on the Jack Vance stories. And the rest of the video will be a walkthrough of each of the books with a discussion of what's cool about them and what's maybe not so cool. As I mentioned, the DCC Dying Earth setting comes in a box set with 3 booklets and a map. The box itself is a slim but sturdy job with full color glossy stock. I've already opened this box before, so the first book you would see is actually this one, The Player's Librum. The cover art by Doug Kovacs is appropriately weird and sort of awkward in quintessential Goodman Games spirit. The book is thin and glue bound. You get one helpful table on the back. The interior is pretty bog standard black and white. We'll be delving into the contents of these books later in the video. Book 2 is The Primer of Practical Magic with more really great art for the cover. One irony about the title is that magic in the Dying Earth setting and really in DCC in general is never practical. I think they were just going for a little alliteration or something there. The interior layout is styled in the DCC templating that you'll see in virtually all of the Goodman Games DCC books. We'll go over it a bit more later, but you'll also notice really long spell descriptions here. Book 3 is absurdly titled Intimate Anatomy of Several Creatures and Personages of the 21st Eon. This is basically a source book that has gods, monsters, items, and NPC archetypes that you'll find in the setting. You might have noticed an ISB and individual price on the back of each of these booklets, and it's true that you can buy these separately, but I'll just tell you right now, if you want to run this setting, you're going to need all 3 books. I guess they split up the materials into 3 books so that they can sell them in a boxed set because people go wild for box sets these days. But honestly, this would have been pretty nice as a single stitch-bound tome with that Goodman Games stamp of quality that they have with their hardbacks. Anyway, the other major thing in the box is a really trippy world map. It's really hard to describe this art style. You can't really say that it's world class or anything, but it is as if a genius dungeon master in high school from the 1980s drew and colored it. And the fact that this is an intentional style does make it more brilliant than you might think at first blush. I think my point is that I'm really into the artists that Goodman Games employ in their books. I just really dig what they're shooting for here. So that's the boxed set. Let's talk about the original stories by Jack Vance for a second. The authors of this supplement give you a very helpful guide to which Jack Vance stories are most essential to getting the most out of this setting. This list here not only enumerates all of the source material, but highlights in bold the most important stories or chapters from each book that you'd want to read in order to get to the heart of quintessential Dying Earth. I spent a long time looking for all of these books, but ultimately, I've found and settled on one cheap, easy, and elegant solution. The 4 official primary Dying Earth novels are contained in a single publication right here. If you're in the States, you can probably get a copy of this for relatively cheap on Amazon like I did. I'll leave a link down below for that. This particular volume contains all of the stories that are highlighted in this supplement, so it's a one-stop shop. As for the actual stories themselves, I think what makes them great is twofold. The first is that oftentimes your main character in these stories is so bad that he's not even an anti-hero, he's just a villain. And this is a characteristic that is deeply woven into the playable game setting as well. The sorcerers of Dying Earth are often cruel and cunning and extremely covetous of the knowledge of magic, stealing it from others and safeguarding it for themselves. Sometimes the villainy of the main characters goes a little too far, especially in light of basic modern sensibilities, but I thought this moral angle was fun and refreshing to read. The other thing that makes these stories great is that the fantasy world is so utterly weird and novel. It's not standard Tolkien-esque fantasy that's basically a rehash of medieval European folklore. The Dying Earth cultures and its plants and animals are truly strange. And I think that factor more than any other is what drives this setting as something you'd want to play inside of. There is one other major feature of this literature that is worth noting, and that is the verbose nature of the prose. Take it or leave it, but these stories are all written with relatively flowery language. You not only get a lot of B-side SAT words, Vance makes up a lot of new words as well. This whole feature is embraced quite thoroughly in the DCC supplement, as I'll show you throughout the rest of the video. Okay, here's the first of the 3 books from the DCC Dying Earth box set, the Player's Librum. Just look at these funky people standing around on the cover. This is just welcome to Dying Earth. This first book covers the setting, its history, 4 distinct character classes, and a hodgepodgery of other things totaling about 66 pages. This is where you'll find that very handy reading list here on page 5, which we've already discussed. And then there's the discussion of the setting itself. It's described as such, quote, DCC Dying Earth is set in the distant last days of the Earth, a place so ancient its history has been long lost, where the weak sun casts a wan gloom over the unpeopled wildernesses and crumbling remnants of the past. It's basically a fantasy setting where you get wisps of technology and science, but it's woven into a place very far in the future and with magic. And as far as the magic, it's described as a zero-sum game, which is in line with the DCC approach to casting generally. You get a lot of organized recapitulation of the setting from the novels here, but I'll be honest with you, some of it is really not useful at all to a GM. Like these descriptions here, they're just too brief to be used in any way. These descriptions of people and groups are a bit more useful just by the fact that the subjects in each entry are more focused. But it lurches back to less useful again with these extremely short location descriptions. I think it's admirable that the authors were able to sift through all the original writings and suss this stuff out, but it almost seems like they didn't want to add any of their own details to the canon or something. So they just reported what they could find in each area. As far as character creation, it is largely the same as the default rules in the Dungeon Crawl Classics core rulebook, but there are a few differences that I want to point out. The first is determining a starting animus. All player characters have incurred the wrath of some powerful group or entity. And when that antagonistic personal situation crops up in the story being told at the table, the player needs to make a DC 10 luck check or something bad happens. This is in line with many of the original stories where one main character or another has made enemies and karma occasionally catches up with them. I wouldn't go so far as to say that you're supposed to play an awful person in this game, but look at this. You can incorporate this optional rule of grudge tokens, wherein every time a player rolls a 1, they get one of these tokens, and they can spend them to make another player re-roll a successful roll and keep the second roll no matter what it is. This sets up a bit of a PvP situation where players can kind of antagonize each other directly. This may not work for your characters or for your gaming group generally, so tread with caution here. Each of the animuses, by the way, are rather nicely described on the following pages. The next thing about character creation that is notably different from the core DCC rules is VAT thing starting traits and VAT things generally. Basically, in the Jack Vance stories, VAT things are techno-magically created creatures that can take virtually any form, but are usually intended to be human and also intended to serve their creator. If you choose to play as a VAT thing, you have to choose your pattern, which is one of 3 things. Martial, where you're a fighter, Paragon, where you're an artist, or a Theologue, where you're a scholar of sorts. These are each associated with core stat bonuses, an alignment, and training with different kinds of weapons. VAT things also start with a flaw, and there are a few here that I want to point out. When you roll on this D30 table, the lower your roll, the better. And as you get higher, the flaws get worse. Check this out. At 15, you emerge from the vat in which you are created with a fleshy tube sticking out of your body. On a 22, you have a fused appendage, which comes with a permanent -1 agility. On a 26, you're covered with eyes. This one is kind of a deal breaker, to be honest. I'm not sure I'd want to play a PC with that. On a 27, you're an inverted inside-out creature. That's also pretty unplayable. And then on a 29, you are a decaying walking corpse. I'm sure this stuff was fun to write, and it is more or less faithful to the spirit of the source material, and really to the spirit of DCC being over the top. But I think you need to be cool and allow players to re-roll some of this stuff if they land on it. The first of the 4 unique classes in this setting's first book is the Magician, and it's a doozy. I don't want to get lost in the weeds explaining all the ins and outs of casting in Dying Earth, but it should be noted that it can get fairly involved mechanically. And in fact, the entirety of the second book in this box set is dedicated to explaining magic. As for the descriptions of magicians in Dying Earth, I thought this passage described them perfectly. Magicians of the 21st Eon are a self-willed and capricious lot, endlessly squabbling with others of their kind and jealously hoarding knowledge that is often acquired after forcing it from a rival through stratagem and negotiation. If ever you wanted to see a game that used Vancian magic in its most faithful and literal form, then you've come to the right place. In Dying Earth, magicians must force spells into their head via memorization, and they can only hold so many spells in their head at a time. You can see on this table how many spells they can have memorized at a time and at which level. One other thing to note is that magicians cannot spell burn, which is they can't temporarily sacrifice certain core stat points in order to enhance a spell roll. Instead, they use a thing called Force of Will, where they spend at least 1 point of personality and add that to a d20 plus their caster level in order to enhance a cast. Magicians can also make a reincarnation check if they've died from bleeding out. Here's more on vat things, which we touched on earlier. They are actually magic casters and can even sort of magically invoke their creator the way a caster would invoke their deity. They also have enhanced skill checks, improved healing, are immune to non-magical diseases and poisons, and anytime they die, the player can make a luck check to see if they are successfully regrown in a vat. Here's my favorite part about that bit. If they are cloned successfully, they retain all of their memories, which is sort of inexplicable. Wayfarers are most akin to rogues. In fact, they're described up here as fortune seekers, con artists, and churlish rogues. They can cast magic, but must have a librum or scroll for the spell they're casting, so it's fairly limited. They can only memorize a single spell at a time. They have a shifting luck die that goes up and down the DCC dice chain as they succeed and fail luck checks, and they get enhanced bonuses when burning more luck points at a time than fewer. They also get a bonus die when trying to talk their way through or out of things called a rhetorical deed die, and that increases a ridiculous amount as they level up. The witch is a practitioner of dark magic and rituals. There are no two ways about it, they're just kind of evil. A witch can use spell burn to enhance their spell rolls, but it comes in the form of ritual sacrifice of a living creature. I don't normally see play features like this in an RPG, so it was pretty surprising. You're probably not going to find content warnings in a Goodman Games book, so if you're squeamish about killing innocent little or big animals in your game solely to enhance a roll, consider yourself warned in this video. There's a pretty easy workaround here if you don't want to have sacrifices in your game, and that's just to have the witch draw their own blood as their sacrifice, or maybe even sacrifice precious items or money to juice their casting rolls. Another major feature of the witch is demonic taint, which is a number that starts at 0 but ticks up every time the player rolls a 1 on a spell check, or when a spell check is less than or equal to their character's current demonic taint score, which is to say, the higher it gets, the more likely it will increase. I haven't mentioned this before, but one of the frustrating things about these books is how some of the rules for magic are described in the first book, but then referred to a second book. For example, right here, you learn about demonic taint, but to see the table of demonic corruption possibilities, you have to go to page 29 of the second book. Anyway, one last huge feature of the witch is how they can transfer vitality or life from one creature to another. This circles back to animal and maybe even human sacrifice, but basically they can heal party members by stealing life points from another living creature. I'm actually not sure how you'd play your way around that one, that's just plain devious. There's this section on money, equipment, and gear, but take note of the title. This is homage to the purple prose found in Vance's Dying Earth stories, and it's pretty fun if you enjoy this kind of playfulness with the English language. And speaking of weird, unwieldy features that would be hard to translate to most play tables, check out some of the currencies that are used in the setting. Different materials and substances have different values equating to coinage. Imagine trying to keep all that straight during your interminable shopping sessions. A lot of the weapons and armor are bog standard fantasy fare, but some of the equipment and gear went right over my head. These items in particular could have used an illustration or at least a sentence worth of description because they're pretty alien otherwise. Here's another example of the authors doing an amazing job of porting details from the original novels to a table. In this case, the spoken languages of Dying Earth. I don't find that foreign languages come up that much in play, but just as a reference, it's cool to have this list of all languages that they were able to extract from the stories. And then finally, in this first book, you have this impressive list of 100 unusual and made-up words that Vance used in his stories. And this brings up a huge question. How many people are there out there who, 1, play tabletop RPGs, 2, are familiar and maybe even read up on the Dying Earth stories, and 3, are quick-witted enough to use all these strange words in the course of play? I imagine it's a pretty thin slice of the general population we're talking about here. But in terms of reading enjoyment and basking in the fandom of Jack Vance's fantasy writing, this is purely a gift. Okay, so I intended to cover all 3 of the books in this box set as closely as I've done the first one, but this video is going on a little long, so I'm going to be pretty brief with the last 2 books. This second book is titled The Primer of Practical Magic, and like I mentioned, it covers all the magic mechanics of the setting and runs 106 pages. One of the most important features of a spell in this setting is its so-called provenance, or where it came from. This table here on the right gives you about 100 possible spell origins, and this takes the place of the Mercurial Magic table in DCC's core rules. But the purpose of the table is the same, to make the acquisition of spells risky, unpredictable, and unique with each playthrough. You don't have to use this table, and can still in fact use the Mercurial Magic table if you want, but if you want some fresh possibilities, you can roll your dice here. Here's something I thought was interesting. The setting only has so many spells available in it, and most of them are from DCC. The rest of them are unique new spells created for Dying Earth. But when accessing them, at least initially, Magic users will find them in only 1 of 6 books, and each of these books is an actual named publication with a specific list of spells. So by starting with one of these books or another, you start with access to predefined lists of spells, as seen here. Sandestans come up a lot in this setting here. They're basically familiars made of pure phlogiston or magical ether, and you can acquire a spell that will create them, and they'll show up in any kind of form that you can imagine, although they're usually relatively small. But here's the thing. They're not willing servants. You have to track indenture points, and you're always running the risk of running out of those and having the Sandestan abandon you or even turn on you. Pretty crazy. Here's the table of demonic corruptions that can befall your witch if you pick up enough corruption. Like I mentioned, it would have been nice if this was just right there in the witch section in the first book. As far as the demonic corruptions themselves, you definitely want to roll low on this table. I didn't mention it before, but witches can ensqualm, or basically cast curses, and there are 14 squalms listed in this book. They are divided into minor, moderate, and major curses. There are 2 lists of spells for this setting, the first of which is this list of arcane spells. They are divided into levels 1 through 5. The arcane spells list contains 32 new spells on top of the several dozen from DCC, and this witch divine spells list contains 7 new spells. And then you get a description of all 39 or so new spells presented in the familiar DCC format of insanely long paragraphs for every possible gradation of outcome from your casting roll. The one thing that makes these spells even more difficult to manage and understand than DCC spells is that the names are often written in that Vancian style. I thought this was interesting. You may be familiar with Prismatic Spray in D&D, but as you know, it originally came from the Dying Earth novels. So here in this supplement, you get a more faithful rendition of the spell, which was referred to in the books as the excellent Prismatic Spray. But yeah, look at these spell descriptions. It's the Achilles heel of Dungeon Crawl Classics, and the authors here chose to be faithful to this unfortunate tradition rather than opt for a shorter, more practical description of spells and their effects. Intimate Anatomy of Several Creatures and Personages of the 21st Eon is the 3rd and final book in the core box set. If this kind of verbose titling is getting on your nerves at this point, then it's official. Dying Earth is not for you. I think it's pretty fun, personally. I have to point out that this cover by Doug Kovacs is particularly classic in both its weirdness and in the fact that something very bad is happening to a character. This book covers 4 of the godlike patrons of the setting, magic items and relics, and a bestiary, and list of enemies. Padde is the first of the 4 patrons, a magician so powerful that he lives in his own plane or dimension. And just like with a god or a patron AI, such as from Mutant Crawl Classics, you can invoke him to help you out, as well as anger him and incur unique levels of taint. And by being associated with Padde, you get these 3 patron spells. Note create Vat Thing. I might be mistaken, but I think this is the only way to actually create Vat Things as a PC in the game. Here are a couple of eye-popping snippets from the create Vat Thing spell. Check this out. Even at the very highest casting rolls at 34 to 35, as well as 36 or higher, the Vat Thing that you create, quote, has absolute free will, and any sign of weakness by the caster causes the Vat Thing to despise its creator and seek opportunities to destroy him. This is not a great feature to have in a servant or familiar. Essentially, even in the best case scenario, when you create a Vat Thing, you're playing with fire. Kron is an encephalitically endowed demon lord who drinks the liquefied brains of intelligent beings in order to acquire their mental prowess. He's a favorite among witches. His 3 spells give you magical sight, temporary expertise, or, demonic acid placed directly onto the brains of a target, and thereby inflicting extreme damage and permanent loss of points in personality and or intelligence. The Pragmatica is some kind of silicon-based entity that is thematically focused on logic and mathematics. Its spells include heightened magical sight, a mental attack that can erase a target's mind, and the Prime Unhinger, which is a hard-to-describe attack on time-space in the vicinity of the target, causing terrible damage. Okay, this actually reminds me of one issue I do have with the flowery language as used in these supplements. I feel like the authors started in the first book by keeping the fancy words limited to diegetic or in-game descriptions of things, but here by the 3rd book, they seem to have fully committed to describing even the rules in flowery terms. This is problematic in cases like this spell, as well as many other portions of the book, because it impedes the explicit understanding of what the hell a thing is supposed to be. Anyway, Uthaw is the 4th and final patron, and it's reminiscent of an elder god in the Cthulhu mythos. Squid-like, extremely powerful, uncaring of humanity, but also drops into worldly affairs of humankind every so often and makes a mess of things. I wasn't able to get much from this description of regions and areas, just as I wasn't from the shorter treatment of them in the first book, but I do appreciate the world map for what it's worth. This regional encounters table could come in handy, with 21 creatures in total, which can be bumped into depending on what part of the map you're in. There are a handful of very dangerous but intensely interesting and unique magical items and talismans that you can throw at your player. This is Dying Earth, so things can get pretty weird. Maybe the most important of all these zany items is the Ioun Stone, which are these little plum-sized stones that embody magical power. Magicians the world over search for and covet these stones because they impart increased power if you feed them memories and intelligence points. Specifically, check this out. They actually store spell burn points or force of will points, which can be spent anytime. Which is to say, you can stuff these things full of points, recover from the donation, then use those stored points without having to make any stat sacrifices at the time of casting. It's a way of casting with extremely high bonuses, basically. The list of beasts here is great, and in the spirit of DCC, they seem novel and mysterious. I actually appreciated the descriptions here just as a means to clarify what I read in the original stories. Often in the stories, Vance would mention things like gids and grus without any explanation of what they were, and you'd maybe get some kind of offhand description many pages later. So it's nice to essentially have the Dying Earth source book here to clear it up in virtually every instance. I would have liked to have seen an artist's interpretation of a teratoid, which is statted pretty extensively as a sort of stand-in for a horse. As you can see, their description extends for 2 full pages. There is more setting-specific bric-a-brac at the end, but one that I really like is this list of provisions. Notice that these entries mostly don't indulge in the overly verbose nomenclature used in most of the setting. It's kind of a relief, since it would be easier to incorporate these kinds of items at a table of uninitiated. Alright, here are my thoughts on the DCC Dying Earth core books. Verbosity cuts both ways. As I mentioned, I love how the creators channeled Vance's penchant for obscure and made-up words and his flowery arcane descriptions, but when the authors here use the same language to describe rules and spells, it feels a little bit like they got carried away with things. Hard to find a group. How exactly is one going to find a group to play this setting, to really buy into the weirdness of the world, the generally dubious morality of the PCs, and of course the exotic flexing of the English language? I have a hard enough time finding enough players for a night of Tales from the Loop. 3 books instead of 1. It's ironic that I complained about the DCC core rulebook being too long in my DCC video, and that they should have made magic and spells a separate volume. In the case of Dying Earth, it would have been a lot more convenient, I think, if they just integrated everything into a 275-page book. I don't think 275 pages is unreasonable, and really, if you account for the redundant info between the 3 booklets, you're probably talking about 260 pages. And considering the quality that Goodman Games puts out with their hardbacks, that would have been a sturdy and attractive hardback. Definitive Dying Earth guidebook. I think first and foremost, whether this is a playable, practical setting or not, these 3 books represent an invaluable guide to Jack Vance's Dying Earth novels and short stories. They fill in all the gaps and answer all the questions that might go unanswered if you only read the stories. Wildly original. The setting is so strange and the characters are so off-kilter morally that this really is a sort of antidote to the extreme boredom you might experience after playing a super generic high fantasy setting for years. The spells, items, gods, everything is just so sideways in this world. More and more. This isn't really a feature of the core books, but the fact that there are multiple additional Dying Earth supplements already published means that you're not just stuck with these 3 booklets when trying to create an adventure in this setting. At the time of recording, there are 10 Dying Earth publications on the Goodman Games website, each running $9.99 for print plus PDF. It's a pretty deep bench. In the end, I honestly can't say that I'll ever be able to find a group to play this, but I think almost more than any other setting supplement I've ever read, I really enjoyed the reading of this supplement. And just to be fair, I have spoken with a number of people who have run and played this setting, so it's not impossible. I'll leave a link down below to a Discord server where you can find those kinds of folks, as well as links to where you can buy the supplement itself. If you've run or played DCC Dying Earth, please let me know how your games went down in the comments. Thanks as always for watching. See ya.